Good morning. It's good to have all of you with us this morning. We're time to begin our Bible class. We're in Exodus chapter 27. We've been studying through the book of Exodus and looking at the instructions that God has given to Moses up on the mountain for the tabernacle and its furnishings and all those things that are going to be inside of the tabernacle itself. At the end of chapter 24, we're told that Moses went up onto the mountain and told the folks that if they had a problem, if they had a question, that they could bring it to Aaron or to Hur, that he was leaving them down there to take care of matters while he was up on the mountain. And at the end of chapter 24, it says Moses went up on the mountain, and he's going to be up on the mountain with God for 40 days and 40 nights. So he's going to be gone for a little while. He's getting these instructions. Now, the instructions that he's getting for things is what they are to build and how they are to build it and what they're to build it with, the materials that they are to use when they construct the tabernacle itself. God told them, I want you to make a sanctuary for me in chapter 25 that I may dwell with you. And so he wants them to make this holy place where he's going to dwell with the children of Israel. And he iterates to them several times that see that you make all things according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. Everything that Moses is going to build, everything that he's going to make, everything that the children of Israel are going to construct with regards to the tabernacle are going to be according to the pattern that God showed to him on the mountain. And a couple weeks ago, we looked in the book of Hebrews to see that the things that they built on earth were copies and shadows of things that are in heaven. That there's a lampstand that represents something in heaven, that the table of showbread represents something in heaven, that this dwelling place, the mercy seat, represents God's throne, that's where we go to get grace and mercy in our hour of need, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. And so the tabernacle had its importance, it had its place as a foreshadowing of things to come, but also as a copy and a shadow of the things that are in heaven where God dwells, that he was going to dwell amongst them. And so we were looking at the tabernacle and the things that are in the tabernacle itself. And so outside of the tabernacle, we've got, it references the temple. Well, that's the holy place and the most holy place. They're going to be separated by the veil that we talked about last week. But there's a bronze laver there where they would cleanse themselves or wash themselves before they would perform their priestly duties in the tabernacle. There's the altar of burnt offerings that is there where they are going to bring their sacrifices, and that's where the sacrifices are going to be given to God. They're going to be, the burnt offerings will be burned up on that altar, and the rest of their sacrifices would be cooked on that. If you think of it as being like a big barbecue, that's kind of what it is. It's kind of a big barbecue grill where they would actually cook the sacrifices, and some of those things they would get to partake of. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Good morning. So we're in Exodus chapter 27 this morning, and he's going to talk about the altar of burnt offering. That altar that is there, it's referenced as the brazen altar in the picture. It's right there in the middle of the courtyard. It says, you shall make an altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. The altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. You shall make horns on its 4 corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it. You shall overlay it with bronze. So he gives Moses the instructions here for this altar that they are to make. 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. How big is that in feet? Does anybody know? 7.5. So it's 7.5 feet wide and 7.5 feet deep. I mean, that's a pretty good size grill. And so they're going to make it with wood. They're going to construct it with wood. Now, if you're going to have a fire and you're going to cook things, you don't necessarily want a grill that's made out of wood, but they're going to make it with wood boards, and then they're going to overlay it with bronze. And so it's going to kind of be hollow inside, or the boards that are inside are going to weigh less than if this thing were solid bronze, because they're going to pick this thing up and move it. Right, this thing it's not like you're going to build a grill out in the backyard 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet, and you're going to brick that in, and that's going to be there. You know, you could do a lot of barbecuing on a 7.5 foot square grill, couldn't you, Jake? Hook it up to a truck, yeah. Well, they didn't have a Dodge Ram or a Ford F-150 to move that thing around. They're gonna put poles in it, and they're gonna carry it on their shoulders, and so it's gonna kind of be hollow, and so it's gonna be overlaid with bronze, it says, and so it's made with these planks sheathed in bronze. The one that's built later, right, this is the altar, or this is, yeah, the altar of burnt offering that they're going to make that's going to go with them with the tabernacle. This one they're going to move around. Later, when Solomon builds the temple, Solomon's going to build a much bigger altar of burnt offering. Solomon's altar is 30 feet by 30 feet and 15 feet high that he builds in the temple itself. And so, as much barbecuing as you could do on a 7.5 by 7.5 grill, just imagine if that was 30 feet by 30 feet. You get a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe they were sinning more and they needed bigger space for their sacrifices by the time Solomon comes along. But his altar is going to be a lot bigger than that. It says, you shall make its horns on its four corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it. Likely these probably look like the horns of what was being sacrificed. They're sacrificing bulls and oxen and goats. Oh, did you have a question over there?
Oh, I was just going to say, just take a look at after Solomon built the temple, the sacrifices that were made on the commemoration day.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of animals.
Yeah. Yeah, when they commemorated the temple, right? When God's Spirit moves in 1 Kings chapter 8, yeah, they sacrificed a lot of animals on that. They're going to sacrifice a bunch of animals to consecrate this and to consecrate Aaron and his sons to be priests as well. But the horns that are on the altar, they would symbolize power most of the time if a horn would be used that way. And so when we read about beasts with horns, whether it's in the book of Daniel or in the book of Revelation, the horn there usually is reference to power, right? And so there's power, if you will, in the sacrifice, that it's going to give them atonement for their sins. But ultimately, who's going to make atonement? Jesus is, right? They're going to be forgiven of what they've done based on the animal sacrifice, the substitutionary sacrifice that's going to be made on this altar. But ultimately, that what relieves us of our sins is the blood of Christ, whether in the first covenant or in the second covenant. And so the horns probably look like what they were sacrificing. They would sprinkle blood on these horns. During some of their sacrifices, the horns of the altar, they would either sprinkle the blood or put blood on those horns as part of the sacrificial system. There was a custom in Israel that the horns of the altar were considered to be a place of refuge or a place of sanctuary, that if you were in trouble with the law, that you could run into the tabernacle area and you could grab hold of the horns of the altar, and that would somehow give you some sanctuary or some refuge, like a sanctuary city sort of thing. And so there was a custom in Israel to do that. Look over at 1 Kings chapter 1. 1 Kings chapter 1. Now in David's latter years, he was going to name Solomon to follow him as king, but in the meantime, one of his sons, Adonijah, decided that he was going to try to take the throne for himself. In 1 Kings 1, beginning in verse 49, it says, all the guests who were Adonijah were afraid and arose, and each one went his way. Now Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. And it was told Solomon, saying, indeed, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, for look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. So Solomon becomes king instead of Adonijah. His attempt to usurp the throne doesn't work, and then Adonijah is afraid that Solomon's going to put him to death, and so he clings to the horns of the altar as a place of refuge. If you turn over one chapter in 1 Kings chapter 2, after Solomon becomes king, there's Joab, who had been the general of David's armies. Joab was one of his nephews, and Joab had killed two men that were innocent, and he's afraid that now he's going to be punished because he went with Adonijah and the rebellion. And so notice in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, it says, news came to Joab, for Joab had defected to Adonijah, though he had not defected to Absalom. So Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord, took hold of the horns of the altar, and King Solomon was told, Joab has fled to the tabernacle of the Lord. There he is by the altar. And Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, go, strike him down. It didn't matter that he had grabbed onto the horns of the altar in that occasion. Solomon was not going to spare him. In 1 Kings chapter 2, you kind of have this, it's almost like a Godfather kind of scene where David's on his deathbed and he's telling Solomon, you make sure you get Joab. You don't let him go down, don't let his hoary head go down to the grave, right, because he killed two men who were better than him, that were innocent. And so David's kind of given some orders to Solomon of, these guys did things that are wrong, and David didn't execute justice, but he's encouraging Solomon to execute justice for those folks. A lot of history there. I don't mean to confuse you with all of that, but the horns of the altar is what I was getting at. That was seen as a place of refuge, that you could go grab on to the horns of the altar and you could receive refuge. And sometimes they did. In this particular case with Joab, it didn't work for him. But they didn't have cities of refuge yet. They're going to have some cities of refuge that are going to be established once they move into the land of Canaan. Archaeologists have found stone altars with 4 horns in Israel, in various different places, including Megiddo and Beersheba and other places around Israel. So this was a common thing, that they would put horns on their altars, maybe kind of signifying again what it was that they were sacrificing to God. And so he gets this instructions that they are to make this altar for their offerings. In verse 3, coming back to Exodus chapter 27, verse 3, it says, also you shall make its pans to receive its ashes, and its shovels, and its basins, and its forks, and its fire pans. You shall make utensils of bronze. You shall make a grate for it, a network of bronze, and on the network you shall make 4 bronze rings at its 4 corners. You shall put it under the rim of the altar beneath, that the network may be midway up the altar. So they're to build this altar, right? It's going to be square. It's going to be 7.5 feet square. It's going to be made with boards overlaid with bronze, so it won't be too heavy. But then there's going to be this bronze grating that's going to nest inside of there about halfway down. That looks like that's what they're going to grill the offerings on. That's where they're going to cook them. It's going to be raised up in the air, so there'll be a fire underneath, and then this bronze grating will be what they're going to lay the sacrifices on in order to cook them down, or to on the burnt offering, the whole thing would be burnt, right? And so this rim that's midway up the altar. You shall make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with bronze, and the poles shall be put in the rings. The poles shall be on the 2 sides of the altar to bear it. You shall make it hollow with boards, as it was shown to you on the mountain, so shall they make it. And so, again, this admonition that you make it according to the pattern that's shown to you. God had specific instructions for what it was that he wanted them to build, how he wanted them to build it, the size, the materials that they were going to use, and then ultimately what they were going to use these things for. So when people today say, well, it doesn't really matter how you worship God, God doesn't care about the details as long as you worship him. Does this look like a God that isn't concerned with detail? This looks like a God who is concerned with the details, right? The details are important. Something else to kind of notice here is we looked at some of the things that were inside that tent, right? That were inside the holy place and inside the most holy place. And with the Ark of the Covenant and the table of showbread and the lampstand, what were they to make those things out of? What was that all overlaid with? Gold, right? Gold. The things that were inside were overlaid with gold. Right? As you approach God, it was more and more precious, the materials that they used. But as you move outward from the tent, now we get to this altar of offering. What's it overlaid with? Bronze, right? Not as expensive, right? So as you move away from God, as you move away from the center of this, notice moving from the most precious metals to metals that aren't as precious, right? That the most precious things are there with God, because what we have with God is more precious than anything else. And as we get further away from God, think about it, as we get further away from God in our lives, we become less precious to him, don't we? We're more precious to him when we're close to him. And those precious materials are there close by where God is going to reside. And so there seems to be some symbolism with that as you move away from where God is, the materials become less precious. Comments or questions on these things? In verse 9, he begins talking about the court of the tabernacle, this outer tent, if you will, that's around the outside. He says, "You shall make the court of the tabernacle for the south side. There shall be hangings for the court made of fine woven linen, 100 cubits long for one side. And its 20 pillars and their 20 sockets shall be bronze. The hooks of the pillars and their bands shall be silver. Likewise, along the length of the north side, there shall be hangings 100 cubits long, with its 20 pillars and their 20 sockets of bronze, and the hooks of the pillars and their bands of silver. Along the width of the court on the west side shall be hangings of 50 cubits, with their 10 pillars and their 10 sockets." And so he gets the dimensions here for this courtyard. So even with regards to the courtyard, there's specifics that God has given to Moses as far as what they are to build. This whole complex itself is going to be 100 cubits by 50 cubits, so roughly 150 feet by 75 feet. And so inside of there, you're going to have different tables where they could bring their slaughter to and kill it, the sacrifice, and then the priests would put it on the altar in order to be burned up. Now, they had different types of offerings that they're going to offer here at the tabernacle. There's burnt offerings, and the burnt offering is the whole thing's going to be burned up. And they're not going to get to eat any of that because it's a whole burnt offering. So the whole animal belongs to God in a burnt offering. And so they don't get to partake of any of that. But there are also sin offerings and trespass offerings. Now there's some differences in the offerings. You read about all of this in Leviticus. But a sin offering is if I've committed some sort of sin, I've done something, maybe I've said something that has offended my brother, or I've offended somebody in my speech, and so I've sinned and I've got to make an offering, but there's really no way to make restitution for that, right? There's no restitution that can be made for that. So a sin offering would be for my sin, and I don't get to partake of any of that. I don't get to benefit from my sin offering, but I have to bring a specific animal, and that animal will be slaughtered, and there are certain fatty portions that would be put on the altar, and those would be burned up completely. Those would be God's portion of that sacrifice. But there are other portions of that sacrifice that the priests were allowed to eat. And that's one of the ways that God took care of the Levites. It's one of the ways that God took care of the priests, is that they got to eat of those sacrifices that other people brought for their sins and for their trespasses, that they would get to eat portions of that. And so the Levites, when they get into the land, they don't get a portion of the land, right? When they divide the land up amongst the tribes of Israel, there's no portion of land that's given to the Levites, but God's taking care of them. They're going to take care of the tabernacle. They're going to serve in the tabernacle, and God's going to take care of them. They're going to get to eat a portion of those sacrifices. Now, a trespass offering would be different. If instead of saying something to offend someone, let's say I stole Michael's pet lamb and roasted that and had it for dinner, and so I'd have to pay him back, right? And if it was a lamb, I'd have to pay it back fourfold. So I'd have to make a sacrifice. I'd have to sacrifice an animal, but then I'd have to give him 4 lambs to replace his 1 lamb. If I stole $1 from Michael, there could be restitution for that. I'd have to pay the $1 back, but I'd have to add on 20%. So not only would I have to sacrifice an animal as a trespass offering, I'd have to pay Michael back $1.20 for the $1 that I stole from him, right? And so there were these different offerings. Now they also had what were known as peace offerings. These were just because you were thankful for the Lord for blessings that he had bestowed upon you. And so you bring an animal, you say, I'm going to sacrifice this to the Lord, and you would kill the animal, and the fatty portions again would be burned up to the Lord, but the rest of that animal could be eaten by you because you hadn't committed any sin. It's not a sin offering. You're not benefiting from your sin. It's a thank offering. And so it's kind of like a fellowship meal. And so all of those things would be grilled if you will, on this altar of burnt offering, on this altar of sacrifice, that they would use that for cooking. And then they'd kind of sit around, and it says that they would eat that meal in a holy place. Now, it doesn't mean that they would go inside the tent into the holy place. It just means that they would eat it in a place that was clean, a place that was set apart, which was probably inside of this courtyard. So inside this courtyard, you've got all these sacrifices that are taking place, whether they're burnt offerings or sin offerings or trespass offerings or peace offerings. You got people that are sitting around maybe having a fellowship meal together with the priests and their family. But you got the priests that are doing their work inside of the holy place as well. And not anybody's just going to walk in there, right? Because you had to be a priest to go in there. Yes?
That had something called a wave offering. Exactly was that just showing reverence to God? Or exactly what was the wave offering?
Yeah, with the offerings, there was a wave offering and a heave offering. Now, that would be with your sin offerings. So you've sinned, you bring an offering, you're not going to get anything to eat of that, but the priests are. And so they would basically make a wave offering. A wave offering would be they'd wave it up to God, and then they'd bring it back, and the wave offering would go to the high priest. I believe it was the breast that would be the wave offering. And then there was a heave offering, which was kind of the same thing. They would heave it up to God, right? So they're giving it to God, and God is symbolically giving it back to the priests to eat. And so the wave offering and the heave offering were more symbolic, that this belongs to God, but he's given it to the high priest, or he's giving it to the officiating priest. I think the heave offering, was the right foreleg, which would go to the officiating priest. And then the wave offering was of the breast of the animal, which would go to the high priest. I would reckon they ate pretty good, the priests especially. But so they had these various different offerings, and again, all this would take place here within the court of the tabernacle until the temple is built, and then it would be the court of the temple where these activities were to take place. So there's a lot of detail that's here. I don't necessarily want to read through all of this with regards to all the things that they are going to make, but notice in verse 16, it says, "For the gate of the court there shall be a screen 20 cubits long, woven of blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine woven linen, made by a weaver. It shall have 4 pillars and 4 sockets." And so as we go out, right, from the center of this, that the materials become less precious. But when we look at the door, this entrance curtain that's here, that's 20 feet wide, or 20 cubits long, I guess that'd be 30 feet. So it'd be a 30-foot wide doorway that you'd be able to bring all of your animals through, that you'd be able to come in to this. But there's a curtain that's there that would kind of maybe hide what's going on inside, but you could still have a way of getting through there. It's made with the same kind of materials that they used on the inside, right? When they made the holy place and the most holy place. That cloth, right, that particular cloth is blue, purple, and scarlet thread woven of fine linen, which is very similar to how they made the linen for the inside portion. And the curtain that would be the veil that would be there between the holy place and the most holy place. And so Moses is given all these instructions of what it is that they are to make. Now, he's already told them how to make the lampstand. If you skip down to verse 20, talks more here about the lampstand. It says, "You shall command the children of Israel that they bring to you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to cause the lamp to burn continually. In the tabernacle of meeting outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall tend it from evening until morning before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to their generations on behalf of the children of Israel." And so as we move inside, there's that golden lampstand. There's the table of showbread. The table of showbread was always on the northern side. The lampstand was always on the southern side. The entrance to that was always facing east. So when the sun rose in the morning, the sun would shine in there. But at nighttime, that lamp had to be burning, and they had to have oil for that lamp so that that lamp would burn continually. Now, whether continually means from dark until light in the morning, or if it means continually as in 24 hours, they were to have that thing burning, it looks like all the time, that it was to be a continual light or a perpetual light. The pure olives, right, pure oil of pressed olives was the best oil that you could get at that time. And so when we talk about the things that are going to be used in the tabernacle, when we talk about the things that are going to be used in the holy place or the most holy place, it's always going to be the best. Right? God wants the best. Whether it's the sacrifices of their animals, he wants the best. Whether it's the oil that they're going to use to light the lamps, he wants the best. The materials that they're going to use, he wants the best. And this light was to burn continually. We sing a song to the kids, right? A lot of times during VBS, this little light of mine, right? I'm going to let it shine. Our light as Christians in this world, right? Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 14, that we are the light of the world. When should our light go out? When you die? Never, right? Our light shouldn't go out, right? This little light of mine, right? Satan wants to blow, but no, right? We're not going to let him do that, right? We need to let our light shine continually, just like this light was to shine continually, because they're the people of God. If we're the light of the world, our light in the community ought to be burning perpetually, right? It ought to be burning continually. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid, right? So not going to put it under a bushel. We're not going to hide it. We're not going to let Satan blow it out. This little light of ours, we need to let it shine perpetually. And so this was to be a statute for them. Notice in verse 21, it shall be a statute forever to their generations on behalf of the children of Israel. So does that mean that this statute continues today? If it's a statute forever, does that still continue today? Are we supposed to have this tabernacle with the lampstand burning? What happened to this old Mosaic system of worship? It was nailed to the cross, right? Jesus came and he fulfilled those things in the Old Testament, and it was taken out of the way. So sometimes people see this word forever, right, with regards to, well, we need to keep the Sabbath day forever, or that this land has been given to the nation of Israel forever. When you look at the Hebrew word olam, which is the word that's here for forever, it doesn't necessarily mean for eternity. It means for a specified period of time. Right? And it was a statute for them throughout their generations until God brought that system to an end. But the Mosaic system was never intended to be a permanent system. Right? It was never intended to be a lifelong, because God knew that Jesus was going to come, that the Christian age was going to take over the Mosaic system, and the Mosaic system was going to be done away with. And so it was never intended to be forever and ever, but it was intended to be for the period of time that God stipulated that would be in effect. Does that make sense? Did I lose anybody? I know there's a lot of detail that's here, and there's a lot of detail with regards to what God wanted them to do and how God wanted them to do that. And I want you to see the detail. We don't necessarily need to memorize the details, but it's good for us to see the detail that God gives. Because God doesn't always only give detail for the tabernacle itself. He gives some detail with regards to the clothing for the high priest. In chapter 28 and verse 1, it says, "Now take Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me as priest. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar." So God selects Aaron here to be the high priest. We don't have anything prior to this with regards to who the priest is going to be. Different folks are making sacrifices. You might remember that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, how is he described? He's described as being a priest of God Most High when Moses comes across him when he flees from Egypt, right? And so you've got someone who's a priest, but he's not a Levite, right? He's not a Levitical priest. That hasn't been put into place yet. You've got Job in the book of Job, who is offering sacrifices for his family, right? He's kind of acting as the priest for the family there, as the patriarch during the patriarchal period. You have Abraham, who's building altars and making sacrifices to God. And so we don't have a Levitical priesthood yet. God at this point is choosing Aaron to be the one who's going to be the high priest. He says, take Aaron your brother and his son, take them from among the children of Israel, right? So they're going to come out from among the children. They're going to be made separate. They're going to be sanctified. They're going to be made holy. They're going to be brought out from among the children of Israel for a special purpose that God has, because Aaron and his family are going to be the ones that are going to be the high priests. And the high priesthood is going to come through the family of Aaron. In order to be high priest in the Mosaic system, you have to show that your lineage goes back to Aaron. You have to somehow be related to Aaron. And so he takes Aaron and Aaron's sons with him to minister to God as priest. And he mentions Aaron's 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. And so the high priesthood is going to come through Aaron and his children. Now, do Nadab and Abihu, do either of those boys get to be high priests someday? No. What happens to them? They got killed, right? They got killed by God. Why did God kill them? They offered strange fire to the Lord in Leviticus chapter 10. Now what's interesting about this is that God is giving the instructions for the priesthood here. He's going to give some instructions for the garments that the priest is to wear. He's given them all these instructions here in this section of Exodus. In the latter part of Exodus, the children of Israel are going to construct and make all of these things that God has given them the instructions for. And then when you get into Leviticus, they're going to start putting these things into practice. And so he says, take Aaron and your brother and his sons and set them aside, right? They're going to be the ones to be priests. But what he's going to describe here with regards to how they're going to be ordained or how they're going to be made priests, that whole process takes place in Leviticus chapter 8. So we tend to think, well, this is written chronologically, right? That there's something going on in Leviticus 8 that is far removed from what... No, he's given them the instructions here for what it is that they're going to do, a lot of what they're going to do over in Leviticus chapter 8. That's where Aaron and his sons are going to be anointed to be priests. But Eleazar and Ithamar will follow Aaron as priest. And so he says in verse 2, you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty. And so they are to make holy garments, right? Sacred garments for Aaron and his sons. Again, this idea is that they were to bring God their best things. And these garments would be different. They'd be set apart from common clothing. They'd be worn in the service of God. They're briefly described for glory and for beauty as for the reasons for their use. But these are holy garments, right? Aaron, the things that they're going to make for Aaron to wear as high priest when he does his duty as high priest, he's not going to put these garments on and go down to Walmart, right? This isn't common clothing that he's going to wear. These are holy garments. Do we have holy garments that we wear today when we approach the Lord? Does it matter that, are we supposed to wear a suit and tie? And if we're not wearing a suit and tie, we don't have our holy garments on, can't approach the Lord, can't come near to him? God wants our best. So folks sometimes will dress in a certain way to indicate that they're bringing their best to God. But what we wear isn't so much the outer clothing. What is it that we put on so that we can approach God? What is it that we must be clothed in if we're going to approach God? Righteousness? Where does that righteousness come from? Comes from Christ, right? We've got to be clothed in Christ. Just like when Aaron and his sons, they're going to need to put these garments on that they're going to be described here. They need to wear those garments when they approach God, when they draw near to God. They have to have those garments on. And what's going to happen to them if they don't have their holy garments on and they try to draw near to God? They're going to be killed, right? Because they didn't follow the instructions that God gave them, right? So in order for them to be able to draw near to God, they've got to be clothed in those holy garments. In order for us to be able to draw near to God, we have to put on Christ. And if we don't put on Christ, if we haven't been baptized, look at Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 and 27. If we're not clothed in Christ, then we don't have that opportunity to draw near to God. We have to be clothed in the right thing in order to be able to draw near to God. We have to be clothed in Christ. We have an avenue to God that people that aren't Christians don't have. We have an avenue of prayer that people that aren't Christians don't have unless they're seeking the truth and they're asking God for guidance. God isn't going to hear the prayer of a sinner. But we have an avenue that they don't because we're clothed in Christ. We can draw near to God. In verse 3, he says, "You shall speak to all who are gifted artisans, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister me to his priest. And these are the garments which they shall make: a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a skillfully woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. So they shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons, that he may minister to me as priest." God isn't going to say, "I want you to make these things," and they're going to sit around wondering, wonder how long we're going to have to wait for the technology to be available to be able to make a garment like that, or to be able to make a crown like that, or be able to make a breastplate. He's going to give them the skills and the abilities that they need in order to be able to construct these things. So I don't know about you. I'm not a seamstress. I can't even properly sew a hole in my blue jeans without it looking goofy, right? But there are people that are very skilled with regards to sewing and very skilled with regards to making textiles or following a pattern and making a dress or making their own clothing. Those skills come from somewhere, right? It's a God-given ability to be able to do those things. And he's going to give them the ability to be able to make all of these different things. And so the first thing that he talks about here is the ephod. Now, he's going to have these, like a blue robe that he's going to wear, but this ephod is kind of like it's an apron or a vest kind of thing that he's going to wear in front of him. It says, "They shall take gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread and fine linen." Right, again, notice the materials that are being used. Same materials that were used on the veil between the holy place and the most holy place. The same materials that they used on the door to the tabernacle complex. So they're using the best of the materials. "And they shall make the ephod of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread and finely woven linen, artistically worked." In verse 8, "The intricately woven band of the ephod which is on it shall be of the same workmanship, made of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread and fine woven linen." So again, they're using the best of the materials for these things that are going to be on the high priest because he's going to approach God. He's going to draw near to God. The high priest is the only one who's going to go behind the veil into that most holy place on the Day of Atonement, one day a year that he's allowed to go back into the most holy place. And so he's got to have the right kind of clothes on, these things that are precious materials, that he's going to go in there and he's going to minister to them. Now, on this ephod, they're going to have 2 onyx stones, one on each shoulder. And on those onyx stones, they're going to be engraved with the names of the children of Israel on them. So he's going to bear the names of the children of Israel on his shoulders when he goes in and ministers for them. Also on this ephod, there's going to be a breastplate that's going to be attached to this. But basically it has chains of gold. It's going to kind of hang around his neck. It's going to be attached to him, and so he's going to have this vest or this apron that's going to be on that is the ephod. Now in the middle of the ephod is the breastplate. If you skip down to verse 15 here of Exodus 28, it says, "You shall make the breastplate of judgment artistically woven according to the workmanship of the ephod. You shall make it of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet thread." And again, using the best of materials. And then they're to select 12 stones, and they're specific stones, types of stones that God gives them and says, "You pick these 12 stones that represent the 12 tribes of Israel," and those things are going to be in the breastplate. So again, over Aaron's heart, so that when he goes into the tabernacle, when he goes into the most holy place to minister to the Lord, that he's carrying the names of the children of Israel over his heart. And so there's chains for this breastplate. It's attached to the ephod, and so it would kind of be there that you've got this vest and you've got this ornamental, maybe like 9 inches by 9 inches square breastplate that has a pocket in it. Because inside the pocket, he's going to place a couple of things. I get into too much detail and I run out of time. So Aaron's going to, notice in verse 29 of Exodus 28, Aaron's going to bear the names of the sons of Israel on the breastplate of judgment over his heart when he goes into the holy place as a memorial before the Lord continually. "And you shall put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, that they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. So Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually. In the pocket of the breastplate, they were going to place these two things. Now, they're not given instructions to construct the Urim and the Thummim. They're told that they are to put this into the breastplate, which means that these things probably already existed. Don't know exactly what these were. Urim and Thummim in Hebrew mean lights and perfections. And there's a thought that, well, there were these two stones. One was maybe white, one was maybe black. One's a yes stone, one's a no stone. And you would put those in the pocket, and then you would ask God a yes or no question. And you'd reach in and you'd pull out the stone, and yes would be a yes answer, and no would be a no answer. Maybe they used that for the casting of lots. There are places where it says that they wouldn't sit down and eat the sacrificial meal until the priest had consulted with the Urim and the Thummim. And so they got information from God somehow with this. When I used to teach Life of Moses class and we'd get to this section, I'd tell the guys, I'm going to ask you a question on the test. I'm going to say, how did the Urim and the Thummim work? And there's only one answer that's going to be right on the test. If you put anything else on the test, it's going to be wrong. The only right answer is, we don't know. Because ultimately, we don't know how this worked. It could have been a yes or no. There are times where they ask yes or no questions, and they consult with the Urim and the Thummim, and they get answers from God. But there are times where they get information that is way too specific for yes or no questions, unless they asked a ton of yes or no questions. David consults with the high priest and the Urim and the Thummim after the death of Saul to ask what it is that he should do, and he's told that he should go into Hebron. Now, if you got to ask a bunch of yes or no questions. Should I go to Jerusalem? No. Should I go to, Gaza? No. Should I go to, you're going to have to ask a lot of questions before you find out that Hebron is the place to go to, if it's yes or no. But we don't know how this worked. But there are times where they would consult these things. It's one of the ways that God had of communicating with them, is that he would communicate to the high priest through the Urim and the Thummim. And so they would have these things with them. Later, Saul gets angry as he's chasing David, and he has most of the priests killed. There's one from the family that gets away, runs to David and takes the ephod with him and has the breastplate and has the Urim and the Thummim. So David can consult with the Lord, but Saul no longer has the opportunity to consult with God through the Urim and the Thummim. He ends up going to the witch of Endor because God's not speaking to him. Well, you killed most of God's priests. Do you think maybe there's a reason why God wasn't speaking to Saul at that particular time? But this was a way that God used of communicating with him. Any comments or questions on the Urim and the Thummim or anything we've talked about this morning?
The full armor of God, is that any way parallel to this business of approaching God? Because all of those items are associated with Christ.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah, the full armor of God is maybe more defensive in nature, where this is more ornamental in nature. The breastplate here is of judgment. Our breastplate is of righteousness, right? But we've got to be judged righteous. There's going to be a judgment that's going to come. You might be able to draw some parallels, but I don't see a direct parallel, because the armor of God is what we need to put on in order to be protected, right? Because Satan's going to come after us. And so we've got to. Now he had to wear this clothing in order to be protected when he drew near to God, when he went into the most holy place. So I mean, there's some parallels maybe you could draw on principle, but I don't.
We're protected by Christ.
Well, yeah.
And have access through Christ to God.
We have access through Christ to God. Yeah. Christ is our high priest, right?
Yes.
And he's clothed in glory and honor. These garments were meant to clothe Aaron in glory and honors. But Jesus, as our high priest, he's clothed in glory and honor. He's ascended up to the right hand of the Father. Yes, sir.
A comment I wanted to make earlier, I didn't know exactly when, but some people, like you said earlier, they think we need to follow the old law in maybe a small way, like the Sabbath or the Ten Commandments. But I think maybe people forget too that this was not God's law to all the world back then. This was to the Israelites.
Yes.
They were Jews in Jesus' time, but we're not Jews even. And Jesus and his apostles were, but this was settled in Acts that we do not become Jews and then Christians. We have been grafted into God's people.
Right.
But what's amazing is there are so many shadows in the Old Testament we can learn from as Christians. So many things because God is the same God
Yeah.
of the Jews as He is to us. But I think people think, oh, because there's a continuity in the Old Testament, New Testament, that somehow we are the same as like the Israelites back then. But we're separate people.
Yeah. No, you make a good point. This law of Moses that's given, right, this Mosaic system, God tells Moses, speak these things to the children of Israel, right? And so this is given to the children of Israel. And he says, this stuff wasn't given to your fathers, right? This is given to you specifically as the children of Israel. And so the Mosaic law was given just to those children of Israel, just to those Jews. Jesus and the apostles were Jews, right? They fulfilled these things. They were obedient to these things. They fulfilled these things. But as Gentiles, right, this wasn't the law that was given to us, and this wasn't a law that was meant to continue because both Jew and Gentile are now reconciled to God in one body, right? Now that Jesus has come, now that the church has been established, we are both Jew and Gentile reconciled to God in one body. There's no longer two separate systems. Romans talks about us being grafted in, the Gentiles being grafted in, right? But the wall of separation has been broken down between Jew and Gentile. But this was given specifically to the Jews. This was what they were to do, and this is what they were to follow. This is how God wanted them to worship. This is the things that God wanted them to build, right? And he's got different instructions for us in the Christian age. Appreciate your attention, appreciate your comments. We'll break now for the worship hour.